fun. Then she came back, Steve, I really need to go home now. And Steve said, well, I really didn't want to leave the party because I was having such a good time, so I shot her. Okay? And that's the joke, right? But very dark humor, right? So what is setting this up, though, is a false alternative. So at that situation in the party, you're thinking, okay, the alternative Steve faces is take her home, drive her home, right, be the responsible boyfriend, right? Or maybe call her a cab to send her home. Right? Those are the alternatives that are legitimate to facing her. So out of the blue, apparently in his mind, shooting her is another alternative for the circumstance, and that's the one that he chose. And that is kind of a false alternative, Steve, because you do have all of these other options that are a lot less extreme than shooting the person just because you're having a good time at the party. So that's a false alternative, a rather blatant one. The example we looked at earlier as a complex question, it also is a false alternative. Do you want to be a good boy and go to bed? Right, so the mother or the father is presenting it, either there is this package, right, you go to bed, or you're a bad boy. That's the implication. Obviously, there are other options. If you don't go to bed, it doesn't mean you're a bad boy, right, necessarily. So it could be that you stayed up for another 30 minutes and you're still a good boy, right, and so forth. Often in political contexts or religious contexts, people want to turn things into an either or, and they don't want to deal with people socially in an inappropriate way. So you're either with us or you're against us. That's the bottom line that is communicated. But often the case, it's not the case that you're either with or sometimes, of course, you have to make a choice. What you stand for, you don't have any alternatives. But lots of times it's an issue you don't care about that issue. So you're not for or against on this issue, or you're undecided. Maybe I'll be on your side after I think about this more, but at this point, it's a false alternative to say either or. Suppose this is a class involving testing, right? We've talked about certain material, and you're in the midst of taking a test, you're writing away. At the end of the test, I'm the professor, and I come up to your desk where you're writing, and I take your examination, and I say to you, you cheated. And I proceed to tear your examination up and deposit it in the trash. And you say, what? You're surprised? I didn't cheat? And I say to you at that point, well, prove it. Prove to me that you did not cheat. In that context, if that's all I've got, I have committed what logicians call the fallacy of appeal to ignorance. Now, you probably at this point would say, well, how would I try to prove that I didn't cheat? You've been sitting there and you're doing your writing, you didn't look right or left, you didn't have secret cheat sheets. None of those things exist. So there's nothing that you can proffer as evidence of your non-cheating. If you didn't cheat, there won't be any evidence of non-cheating, because not cheating is a non-existence. By contrast, I am the professor. Maybe I have a responsibility to make sure that student work, or part of the responsibility to make sure the student work is reflective of what the student knows. If I want to make the claim that you cheated, then I can point to evidence, if there is such things as evidence, because cheating requires certain actions taking place. I can say, here we were videoing, I can see that you were looking at her thing for a certain number of minutes and copying down what she wrote. I can look in your ear and see evidence that you have a remote speaker in there and someone is feeding the answers to you. Or you have a cheat sheet. Aha, I pull it out from under your desk and so on. In that case, if there were certain actions that actually occurred in reality that are cheating actions, there will be evidence for it, and it's my obligation to provide them. So in that situation, we call it an appeal to ignorance because you are ignorant in this context of not being able to come up with anything to support your side of this disagreement. And I am appealing to your ignorance. You can't prove that you didn't cheat, and then I'm going to take that as evidence for you did cheat, and that justifies me throwing your examination away. Appeal to ignorance is an illegitimate mode of reasoning. I want to make a claim, something exists, it's up to me to prove it. Now, the reason for this is that we all start from a default position of not believing billions and trillions and so forth potential things. Things are not in our heads. So we don't have to start off with some sort of obligation to explain why a certain idea is not in my head right now, why I don't believe a certain thing. It goes the other way around. For me to justifiably or logically have some idea in my mind, I have to show what led me, what facts of reality or inferences from facts of reality led me to have that idea in my head. If I just randomly come up with some idea and say, oh, I want to believe that idea, and you haven't proved why that's a bad idea, you've never considered that idea before, therefore I'm justified in believing whatever random thing in my head, that's appeal to ignorance. Slightly dated example, going back to my mother's generation of college, when colleges were much more ruthlessly segregated between boys' dorms and girls' dorms. And the girls' dorms had very strict policies about times when young men were allowed to be in the dorms, where they could be in the dorms, and when the curfew kicked in and they absolutely had to be out. And these were very strictly monitored. And my mother, tells the case of a young woman she knows, right, who was accused of having a boy in her room at the wrong time. And it turns out that this was just a kind of a revenge accusation from one of the girl's enemies, but she reported it to the house mom, right, or whoever. She has boys in her room or a boy in her room, and the house mother goes up and says, well, you had a boy in your room, and she says, no, I didn't. I said, well, prove it. Prove that you didn't have a boy in your room, right, at that time. Well, how would you do that? That's this is before video cameras and various sorts of things like that. But if she's correct and there was no boy in her room at that, there won't be any evidence of that, because non-existing boys don't leave traces of where they have gone in the world. So in this situation, the obligation is with probably the first girl who allegedly reported it, but certainly the house mother. So if you're going to prosecute, or that's too strong, if you're going to pursue this, rather have some actual evidence for why you are putting this person in the hot seat. Now this takes us to an important distinction that we have to insist upon. We call existence claims versus non-existence claims. So there's a difference between saying or thinking or considering that something exists versus the position of someone who does not consider that something exists, doesn't believe that something exists, or things not actually existing. And the idea of logic is that we're trying to keep our minds connected to reality, and the only thing that connects our minds to reality is evidence, right, from reality. So we always start from the position of asking, if you want to say something exists or something is real or something is true, you start from having the obligation to provide that evidence for it being there. If something doesn't exist, then it doesn't leave any traces. It doesn't leave any evidence. Non-existing things don't interact with anything else in the world, so they can't be detected. They can't be detected because they can't exist. So it's just an empty void. And so asking for evidence of non-existence is a very different kind of claim, right? And it's almost impossible to achieve that. That's why we have a closely related principle that we call the burden of proof principle, or sometimes it's called the onus of proof principle. So sometimes this is a rhetorical issue. Whoever starts the discussion, starts the argument, puts something out there. Let's talk about this. That person does bear an immediate onus or burden of justifying why we should be talking about that. So that can just be partly a motivational issue. But if you are going to make a claim, I think this is true, or I think this is reasonable, I think this is a probability, and so forth, you can't immediately say, this is my claim, now you disprove this claim. That would be to shift the burden of evidence to the other person. If you are the one who's making the claim, you start with the burden of putting some evidence behind that claim. Shifting the burden is almost always illegitimate. Particularly, it's illegitimate if you are allowed to just put these things out there, shift the burden to the other person, and then put something else out there that shifts the burden to that person, because you're never going to get anywhere. Let me give you an example of that. I will, pick on this gentleman here for a moment. Right? Suppose there was some terrible crime that happened last night, and I'm a police detective, and I don't have any evidence right one way or the other, and you just happen to be the first person I come across, right? And I say, prove to me that you didn't commit that terrible crime last night. Yeah, exactly. And you're saying, right, your immediate reaction, what? What terrible? Oh, okay, there was a terrible crime. Well, it wasn't me, okay? Right, so personal testimony says, well, if I don't know you, I can't trust you. Trust me, prove to me that you are a reliable person and you're not lying, right? How would you prove that you're not telling a lie? Right? So then you've got another burden, and you have to start to think, right, and so forth. How could I tell I'm not? He said, oh, well, wait a minute. I just flew back from Switzerland last night when the crime was occurring. Right, so you whip out your passport, and there you've got the the Zurich stamp on your passport from last night, and your Swiss Air flight ticket and so forth. And so you say, aha, see, I can prove that I didn't commit that crime because I've got this other kinds of evidence. I've got a passport with a stamp, the dates are all right, and so forth. I say, okay, well, that's fine. Okay, now I'm a clever detective. And I say, well, prove to me that your passport is not a forged passport. Right, that you didn't pay someone a lot of money to make this fake passport so that you could be secretly committing this other crime as well. So what's going on here is, and I could play this game all day, and maybe you're pretty smart and clever, you can play the game for a pretty long period of time, but you're never going to be able to prove that you did not commit the crime if that's the game that we are playing. I'm consistently asking you to prove a negative. Prove that you didn't commit the crime, prove that you didn't lie, prove that you didn't have this passport forged, prove that you didn't, right? So that constant negative language is always a clue that something is going on. Instead, we say the proper thing is, if I'm going to make an accusation of him in particular, I need to have some glimmer of evidence that ties you, and I can start with that, and then on the basis of that, build a further piece of evidence. So that is the burden of proofs principle and the appeal to ignorance. Okay, immediately following the burden of proof and the distinction between positive claims and non-existence claims, and what we then more formally call the appeal to ignorance, is a long, long history. I want to indicate some philosophical issues behind that, ones that have important implications for law and for religion. It's one that has gone deep in human history. In Roman jurisprudence, for the first time, there was this burden of proof principle, and the claim there was the necessity of proof always lies with the person who lays charges. You want to sue someone in a civil court, if you're the plaintiff, you have an obligation to present the evidence behind your suit. It's not that the person has an obligation to disprove the charges that are just thrown out against them. In a criminal case, right, the police and the entire court system have an initial obligation to come up with the evidence. So we say if you are functioning as a police officer, as I was in the earlier example, I have to have some probable cause. Right? That is to say, I have to have some evidence that the cause involved this particular person, and it's probable. It doesn't have to be certain at this point or even particularly compelling, but I have to have something before I can start interacting with the citizenry and subjecting them to further investigations. If I, as a police officer, gather a significant amount of evidence, and I take it to the prosecuting attorney, and the prosecuting attorney agrees this is worth taking to court, the person is arrested, we bring the person into a court. We are going to have a defense, we are going to have a prosecution. They both will have a chance of making their case, but the making of their case, the obligation of making the case is asymmetrical. right? The burden of proof lies with the prosecution. And if the prosecution fails to prove it, the defense does not necessarily have to do anything. If just on the face of it, the prosecution fails to make the proof, then we are going to consider the person not guilty and let the person go. Another way of formulating this, tightly tied into the principle of the burden of proof, is the presumption of innocence. When you enter into civil society, the presumption is you are an innocent person, you are free to go about your business, and police officers can only interfere with you if they have some grounds to think that you are no longer an innocent person. In a courtroom, even though the person has been arrested, the prosecution thinks they've got a case. In the eyes of the court, that person is still innocent until he or she is proven by the prosecution to be guilty. We don't want the prosecution to be playing the same kinds of games of shifting the burden of proof over to the defense. I'm the prosecutor. I don't have any evidence. I don't have any logical arguments. You, defense attorney, prove that your client is not guilty of the particular crime. That's an illegitimate move. Always it will be objected to and so forth. Now, there is a purely logical reason for this, and that is that distinction between existence claims and non-existence claims. If the person is guilty, that is to say, the person did something, something exists in reality, there will be causal interactions and we can get the evidence for that. So that's why logically we put the burden of proof on the prosecution. If it didn't happen, it's a non-existent thing. There's no non-evidence, right, that the defense can come up with to bring in. You can't bring nothing into the court and say, here, look at the nothing, right? Because the nothing doesn't do anything for you. It's a completely empty nest. But there is another philosophical issue at work. It's one that's often contested even to this day in some legal jurisdictions, because not all legal jurisdictions around the world now, or certainly historically, have had a presumption of innocence or had a burden of proof principle. In some cases, it has been the opposite, and that was for philosophical reasons. There would be the presumption of guilt. So we assume, right, that you are a bad person, and you have to show in some way that you're on the up and up, and then we will perhaps let you go about your business. And then even more formally, when we bring you into a court of law, we will require you to show that you are innocent. Now, sometimes this stems from a philosophically very different view of human nature. If, for example, you think human beings are born bad, awful, terrible, we're all little monsters or whatever, that's the default understanding of human condition. Sometimes we might put this in strong religious language and say that everybody is born in sin, in original sin, and we expect that the badness and the wickedness of human beings is going to dominate their thinking and dominate their actions. If that's your understanding of what it is to be a human being, then human beings are guilty from the get-go, and the innocent or good behavior is something that's going to be exceptional and rather rare. So then you're more likely in a judicial system to say, well, why should we presume that this person is innocent? Chances are very good from the get-go, what we know about human nature, that this person is guilty. So you're going to much significantly lower the burdens of proof on the prosecution, make it a lot easier for the police to arrest and bring people in charge. Your standards of proof from the prosecution will be a lot lower, and you will correspondingly elevate the amount of work that the defense has to do to try to show that they were not guilty in this particular case. So this philosophical issue about whether we think people are born basically good, whether we think they are born basically bad, or whether we think they are born neutral, tabula rasa morally, and might become good or bad, has important implications for legal procedure. And it's also interesting if you look at some of the methods that were considered legitimate for hundreds and hundreds of years in Western jurisprudential circles until in the early modern world they were gotten rid of. You take, for example, trials by ordeal. So suppose, I don't know, there's something has happened in the village, and I'll pick on that guy this time. I think that he is the bad guy, so I will bring him up to the court of law. And did you do this bad thing? Of course, he's going to say, no, I did not do that bad thing. but we all know that everybody's a liar because they're all wicked, so he's probably lying. But what's my evidence that he did that thing? I don't necessarily have it, but we can figure it out by asking him to undergo a certain ordeal. And you will be willing to undergo this ordeal to try to prove your innocence. So here's the ordeal. We'll pretend that this is an iron bar. We'll take this iron bar and heat it up until it is red hot. Red hot means that it will ordinarily burn and damage terribly any human skin that it comes in contact with. We'll ask him to put his hand out. This will be laid in his hand, and he will voluntarily, right? So we're asking him to initiate something, to engage in some action here, clasp it and hold it for a certain amount of time, and then unclasp it. Then we will have the evidence of whether he is innocent or guilty. Now, how is this supposed to work? Well, the evidence here is going to be based on a certain religious presupposition. If he is an innocent person, if he's not a guilty person, that's kind of unusual for someone to be innocent, in fact. But God protects the innocent. Does he not? And so it might be an unusual circumstance that this guy is in fact innocent, but if God really is protecting the innocent, then God will protect him in this particular case. And if we, after this certain amount of time, have him release it and his hand is fine, then he has proved his innocence. But of course, if not, he has failed to prove his innocence and the judicial system takes him away, considers him guilty, and he is gone. So that is the exact opposite, partly driven by different commitments to logic and burden of proof principles, partly driven by understandings about metaphysics and how the world works and our understanding of human nature. One more to take with you, if we take that jurisprudential example of this, and you can think about this one more on your own time, burden of proof principles in discussions of religion. Logicians will argue that, obviously, if we're going to believe in the existence of God, we have evidence, we have arguments, and so forth, so we pay attention carefully to evaluating the arguments for the existence of God. And the open question is, do I think the arguments work? In which case I believe. If I don't think the arguments work, then I disbelieve until better arguments or better evidence comes along. And all of that is perfectly legitimate from the perspective of logic. But the logicians will insist that certain tactics that are sometimes used involve shifting the burden of proof inappropriately. So if we want to talk about the existence of God, well, we are making an existence claim. We are making the claim that in the universe or in reality, there is such a being or beings. And we're going to call him God for the sake of this argument. This person really exists. If I am making that claim, then I bear the initial burden of putting evidence to it, putting logic to it, and so forth. It would be an appeal to ignorance if I am wanting to say God exists, and I would like you to believe in the existence of God, and then shift to you to say, well, prove that God does not exist. And if you cannot prove that God does not exist, then I am reaffirmed in my belief in the existence of God. That is an illegitimate shifting of the burden of proof. So work that one through. Obviously in jurisprudential matters, political matters, religious matters, the stakes are high. This can be a temptation, but it's one, sometimes it also can be quite subtle. So resist and practice. We're now going to turn more to emphasizing the positive, good arguments, valid arguments, as we like to call them in logic, and then even upgrading to sound arguments. Last couple of sessions, we've been focusing unrelievedly on the very common bad arguments that we see fairly regularly, the so-called informal fallacies. We're going to be looking at a class of arguments that we call syllogisms, say why they're called syllogisms in a moment or so. And there's a lot of them, and a significant number of them are valid. And so we will be able to figure out which ones are the valid ones. We'll practice some so we start to kind of train our logic muscles, logic memory muscles to recognize those patterns. And we'll be able to more easily differentiate the ones that are invalid. And again, developing some memory muscle, so to speak, in our logic brains so that when we see or sense those patterns, we'll be less likely to fall for them or to attend to them a little bit more. Now, a syllogism is any argument that has two premises and a conclusion. And there's a division of those into three different types: categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. And over this session and the next section, we're going to develop techniques for identifying those and evaluating them. Before we plunge into that, I want to touch base again with the terminology from our very first session, where we introduced the concept of truth and validity. Once we've done the work of figuring out what the argument is, we've got the premises identified, we've identified the conclusion. Often we start putting them in standard form: premise, however many there are, conclusion. Then we turn to the evaluative work. Is this a good argument, logically speaking? There are the two virtues that we are looking for. Of course, we want to have the premises be true. So when we're making an argument, we start off with an initial logical obligation of, if I'm going to believe something or reason on the basis of something that I believe, I should make some effort to make sure that it's a true, that it's a fact, or that it's justified by some previous logical reason and I can take it as reasonably true. So we will look at all of the premises individually in the argument. Is that true? Is that true? Is that true? Or however much. And then if we have questions about it, we do our side research to reaffirm ourselves whether the argument is true or not. Typically, we don't spend a lot of time on truth in logic classes, largely because we're arguing about everything in the universe and we're developing tools to enable us to argue about anything in the universe. But we don't have time in the logic class to independently figure out everything in the universe or even go research all of the various areas. So in that sense, logic recognizes arguments are going to be good if they have true premises, but that's the job of the physicists, the mathematicians, or you in your ordinary life to gather the data, the facts, to make sure your premises are true. We are more likely to specialize in what you do with those premises, how you combine them and recombine them, sometimes slice and dice them and repackage them in order to try to make an inference, to make a mental move from the premises to the conclusion, to say that this conclusion follows from these premises. And we will take it more or less for granted that the premises are true or arguable about. What we're more interested in is what's going on structurally or formally in the move from the premises to the conclusion. And that is where we use the concept of validity. What's the structure of the argument? What's the pattern of the argument? What's the form of the argument? And then is it a good one or not? If it's a good pattern and we've tested it, we know it's a good pattern, we will say it's valid. If it's a bad pattern, we will say it is invalid. So the clarification is, and technical terminology, just automate it. Right? Truth is a matter of the individual premises. Do they fit the facts or not? Validity or not has to do with the logical moves or the illogical moves that one is making. So in this case here, let's use these three as test examples. First one, all humans are mammals and all mammals are mortal, so all humans are mortal. Now this is a categorical syllogism. It has three categories: mammals, humans, and mortal, and then those three categories are connected in various ways. And what we're interested in for the logic is the nature of that connection. But our basic work is, we would read that through and we would say, there's a so there. So I would circle the so or underline it. Sometimes it's good to have different colors. This is a conclusion indicator. This is my conclusion. All humans are mortal. These must be my premises because all humans are mammals and all mammals are mortal. Now, first evaluative questions. Is it true that all humans are mammals? Okay. Well, as far as I know, true. All mammals are mortal. Is that true? As far as I know, yes. So check, check, check. But we're more likely in a logic class to say, okay, well, this really is an issue for biologists. Right? This really also is an issue for biologists. We're not biology experts here, so let's just take that for granted. Seems like it's true, but what we want to know is, if that's true, and now I've shifted into a hypothetical voice, right? If that is true, and if that is true, does it follow logically that this has to be true? You have no question in your mind that it has to be true. And in this case, we would say yes. So in my evaluator, we say, yeah, fine. We have true premises. Just abbreviating truth with the T. And if this is good logical structure, we would say it is valid. And by valid, we mean the conclusion follows necessarily from those premises. If it doesn't, if there's a big question about it, or we can show that in fact that question is justified and the conclusion does not follow, it is invalid. Now here's the first contrast example. Let's read this one through. All rabbits are birds and all birds eat whales, so all rabbits eat whales. Okay, and you go, oh my God, what's wrong with this guy? Right. Well, lots is wrong with this. Okay, so we start our first evaluative questions. We have the so. All rabbits are birds. Is that true? Well, no. All right, all birds eat whales? No. All right, so we have false premises. The question of validity. If, hypothetical mode, suppose we took for granted that this were true, and suppose we took for granted that this was true, would this follow necessarily, logically? And the answer is yes. Right? This conclusion follows logically from those two premises. So this is a valid argument. And often a big psychological hurdle moving from ordinary language, where we sometimes use valid a little loosely, just generally affirmative, to precise logical language, is to say, in one way, this is a completely ridiculous argument, but it's perfectly valid, and I love it logically speaking. And when you say you love it logically, you're not attending to the truth of the premises. That's an important question, but that's not our question right now. We're interested in the structure of the argument. And in fact, the structure of this argument is exactly the same as the structure of this argument. They're just changing the content. But we're going to abstract from the content and focus on that pattern. That's a very good pattern. It's a very useful pattern. There's lots of them. This pattern is actually structurally called Barbara. All of the medieval monks who first systematically identified all of the possible syllogisms, they gave them each a personal name, and this one is Barbara. So meet Barbara. Right? She is lovely. She's always valuable, always valid, always reliable. Okay. Now this one here, all humans are mammals, and all mammals are mortals, so all humans like jokes. This is our other contrast one. Well, two premises and a conclusion. Here's our so we know this is our conclusion here. All humans like jokes. We do our evaluative work. Well, is this premise true? Yeah. All humans are, well, yeah. All mammals are mortals, yeah. So again, we have true premises. And then we ask, well, supposing those premises are true, does the conclusion follow from them? In this case, we say no, obviously not. This conclusion has almost no connection at all to any of the premises. Yeah, it's true. Here we're talking about humans, and here we were talking about humans, but here humans are connected to mammals, and here humans are connected to jokes. There's no connection in this argument between being a mammal and being a joke liker. So we would need more information to be added, but that information is not here. This conclusion does not follow from this information. This is an invalid argument. And that pattern also, unfortunately, is used rather frequently, not in really obvious cases, but it comes up often enough. It's one of the irrelevant ones. And what we do start to learn is what we want is in the premises for this to be linked to this. Humans are linked to mammals, mammals then to be linked to something else, and then you're looking for a kind of overlap that enables you to link the humans to the other thing. But it becomes very complicated what kind of link and how much information one is getting.